I never thought one moment could ruin everything I thought I knew about myself. As he stood there, the rain soaking his face, I heard him say, "I couldn't stay away." My heart raced. How did it come to this? I tried to ignore the pull, but the truth was undeniable. I was trapped between right and desire. When someone steps into your life unexpectedly, they can leave a mark you never saw coming. What happens when a fleeting connection challenges everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and yourself? This is a story about choices, consequences, and the fragile journey of finding your way back. Before we dive into this unforgettable tale, make sure to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's begin. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the quiet house. I paused, mid-stirring, glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall. My husband Jacob was off on another business trip, and the emptiness of our home felt even more oppressive than usual. I tried to focus on the mundane task of preparing dinner, but it was hard to shake the loneliness that had crept into my life over the years. Jacob and I had been married for 15 years, and while we had shared wonderful moments, they seemed like distant memories now. His career had taken precedence over everything, leaving me to manage our home alone. We had become strangers, sharing the same space, a reality I didn't want to admit, even to myself. The faint sound of footsteps broke my reverie. I turned to see my nephew, Luke, descending the stairs. At 23, he had the kind of youthful energy that I hadn't seen in years. He had been staying with us for a few weeks while he sorted out some personal issues, and though I welcomed his company, his presence had stirred something unexpected in me. Smiling, he leaned against the door frame. "Smells good in here. What are you making?" "Just pasta," I replied, setting the spoon down. "Nothing fancy." "Well, it smells fancy." He flashed a grin that reminded me of how carefree I used to feel before life got so complicated. I felt my cheeks warm, which was ridiculous. It was just a compliment. "Are you hungry? There's enough for both of us." "Oh, yes," he said with a chuckle, stepping closer to peek into the pot. "Need any help?" I shook my head. "It's almost done. Just sit down and I'll bring it over." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the soft hum of conversation filling the space. Luke told me about his plans to get back into college and how he was working part-time to save up for tuition. I admired his determination, though I couldn't help but notice the sadness in his eyes when he talked about his recent breakup. "It's just hard to bounce back, you know," he said, twirling his fork in the pasta. "I thought she was the one." I nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. "Heartbreak is never easy, but you'll get through it. You're young, Luke. You have your whole life ahead of you." His eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt a strange connection, as if we understood each other in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was fleeting, but it left me unsettled. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the television without really watching. My mind kept drifting back to Luke, his laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams. It wasn't the first time I had noticed him in a way that felt different. I shook my head, chastising myself for even entertaining such thoughts. But the truth was, his presence had brought a lightness to the house that I hadn't felt in years. And it wasn't just the liveliness of having someone around. It was the way he made me feel seen. As I turned off the TV and headed upstairs, I told myself it was nothing more than a harmless admiration. Yet deep down, I knew there was something more, something I wasn't ready to face. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the kitchen as I sipped my coffee. I had just finished tidying up when Luke strolled in, his hair tousled and a sleepy grin on his face. "Morning," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee pot. "Morning," I replied, setting down my mug. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, pouring himself a cup and leaning against the counter. "Yeah, though it's kind of weird getting used to such a quiet house." I laughed softly. It takes some getting used to, but you'll find the peace can be nice sometimes. He tilted his head, studying me. Do you ever get lonely? You're here by yourself a lot, right? The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. Sometimes, I admitted, glancing down at my hands. But I've gotten used to it. Jacob works a lot, and I try to keep busy. Luke's gaze lingered on me, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. His concern felt oddly intimate, and I quickly changed the subject. What are your plans for today? I asked, moving to rinse my mug. Probably just some reading and a run, he said, shrugging. Maybe I'll fix that loose step on the porch. That's been on Jacob's to-do list forever, I said with a small smile. I'd appreciate it if you could take care of it. Of course, he said, his tone warm. Anything for you. I looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. The intensity of his gaze made my stomach flutter, and I quickly turned away, flustered. Thank you, Luke, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You've been such a big help around here. It's the least I can do, he said, his voice soft. You've been so kind to let me stay. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the strange tension that had begun to build between us. Luke was always kind and considerate, but I was starting to notice things I hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered on mine during conversations, the way he found small excuses to be near me. Or that afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, Luke came in from his run, his shirt damp with sweat. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and plopped down on the couch, his presence filling the room. You've been busy, he said, nodding toward the neatly folded piles of clothes. Just trying to stay ahead of it, I replied, forcing a casual tone. He took a long sip of water, then leaned back, watching me. You know, you're always doing stuff for everyone else. When do you take time for yourself? I paused, caught off guard again. I don't know, it's just what I do, I guess. Someone has to keep things running. You deserve a break, he said firmly. You work harder than anyone I know. His words touched me more than I wanted to admit. Jacob had never been one for compliments, and hearing Luke acknowledge my efforts felt strangely validating. Well, thank you, I said, smiling. That means a lot. He returned my smile, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged. I quickly looked away, focusing on folding the last of the laundry. That evening, as I stood at the kitchen counter preparing dinner, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Luke leaning against the doorway, his expression unreadable. Need any help? He asked. Sure, I said, handing him a knife. You can chop these vegetables. He stepped closer, his arm brushing against mine as he took the cutting board. The slight contact sent an unexpected shiver through me, and I inwardly chastised myself for reacting so strongly. You're quiet tonight, I said, trying to break the tension. Just thinking, he replied, his tone thoughtful. What? He glanced at me, his gaze intense. About how lucky I am to have you in my life. The sincerity in his voice made my breath hitch. I looked away, focusing on stirring the sauce. That's sweet of you to say. It's true, he said, his voice quieter now. You've done so much for me. I don't think I've ever met anyone as kind and selfless as you. I didn't know how to respond. His words were unexpected, and they stirred something inside me that I wasn't ready to confront. I forced a smile and handed him a bowl for the chopped vegetables. Well, I'm glad you feel at home here, I said, keeping my tone light. More than you know, he murmured so softly I almost didn't hear him. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the day's moments in my mind. I couldn't deny that something had shifted between us, and it scared me. But beneath the fear was a flicker of something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that seemed to amplify every sound. I sat on my bed with a book in hand, though I wasn't really reading. My thoughts kept drifting, a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. A soft knock on the door startled me. I looked up, hesitant. It wasn't often that anyone came to my room unless it was urgent. "Come in," I called, setting the book aside. The door opened slowly and Luke stepped inside. He looked uncertain, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants. "Hey, are you busy?" "Not really," I said, waving him in. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment before sitting on the edge of the bed, a noticeable distance away. I needed to talk to someone. I hope that's okay." "Of course," I said, my voice soft. "What's going on?" He looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting. "It's just been hard lately, with everything, school, the breakup, trying to figure out what I'm even doing with my life." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I feel like I'm just stuck," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "Like no matter what I do, I'm always falling short." My heart ached for him. He sounded so lost, and I could see the weight of his worries etched on his face. "Luke, you're going through a lot right now. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. But you're not stuck. You're figuring things out, and that takes time." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "You really think so?" "I do," I said, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're stronger than you realize, and you're not alone in this." His gaze lingered on me, and I felt the air between us shift, becoming heavier. "You always know what to say," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." A warmth spread through me, but it was quickly followed by unease. I tried to ignore the way his words made me feel, brushing it off as simple gratitude. "You'd be fine," I said lightly, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. "You're capable of more than you think." He leaned back slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. "You have so much faith in me. It's nice. I don't think anyone's ever believed in me like you do." I looked away, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "Well, someone has to," I said, keeping my tone light, "and I'm happy to be that person." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt charged, and I wasn't sure how to break it. Then he reached out, placing his hand over mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a jolt through me, and my pulse quickened. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For everything." I swallowed hard, pulling my hand away gently. "You don't have to thank me, Luke. I'm just happy to help." He nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on me as if searching for something unspoken. I stood, needing to put some distance between us. "It's getting late," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the turmoil I felt. "We should both get some rest." "Kale," he said, standing as well. "You're right. Good night, Aunt." "Good night, Luke," I interrupted, my tone firmer than I intended. He hesitated before leaving the room, closing the door quietly behind him. I sat back on the bed, my heart racing. The conversation had started innocently enough, but it had veered into territory that felt dangerous. I couldn't ignore the way his presence affected me, but I also couldn't allow myself to dwell on it. This was my nephew, I was his aunt. Whatever I was feeling, it had to stop. Part 2, Lingering Thoughts and Unspoken Tension, Act 2, Part 2. The next day, I avoided Luke as much as possible, staying busy with chores and errands. I hoped the distance would clear my head, but the opposite seemed to happen. Every time I saw him, whether he was passing through the kitchen or lounging on the couch, my heart would flutter. I hated myself for it. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself that I was imagining things, blowing harmless moments out of proportion. Luke was just being kind and vulnerable, and I was reading too much into it. But my resolve wavered when I caught him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, he said, smiling faintly, just thinking. About what? He hesitated, then shrugged. Life. You. The way he said it made my breath hitch, but I quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. I hope I'm not giving you too much to think about. Not at all, he said, his gaze steady. You're important to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I busied myself with arranging the books on the coffee table. That's sweet of you to say. It's true, he insisted, stepping closer. I don't know where I'd be right now if it weren't for you. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, but I couldn't let myself go there. I straightened, meeting his eyes with a firm expression. Luke, you're family. I'm always here for you. His face fell slightly, but he nodded. I know. I appreciate you. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I quickly excused myself, retreating to the kitchen. My hands shook as I gripped the counter, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't just in my head anymore. Something was happening, and I didn't know how to stop it. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the moments in my mind, analyzing every glance, every word, every touch. Part of me wanted to confront him, to put an end to whatever this was before it spiraled further. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit existed, wanted to see where it might lead. I turned over, burying my face in the pillow. Whatever this was, it couldn't happen. It shouldn't happen. Yet, despite my resolve, I couldn't help but feel a pang of longing as I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I busied myself with every task I could think of, cleaning, cooking, organizing drawers that hadn't been touched in years. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't escape the growing tension in the house. Luke and I barely spoke, each of us avoiding the other, but the silence felt heavier than any words could have. One night I went downstairs to grab a glass of water and found him sitting in the dimly lit living room. The glow of the television illuminated his face as he stared blankly at the screen. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but when I stepped closer, he turned, his eyes meeting mine. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Not really, I admitted, clutching the glass in my hand. What about you? He shrugged. Same. Just a lot on my mind. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the other end of the couch. The space between us felt like a chasm, yet I could sense the weight of his presence so acutely it was as if we were sitting side by side. What's been bothering you? I asked, trying to sound casual. He let out a humorless laugh, running a hand through his hair. Everything, I guess. Life, the future, you name it. I nodded, understanding his frustration. It's okay to feel lost sometimes. Everyone goes through it. Do you? He asked, turning to face me fully. His eyes searched mine as if looking for some hidden truth. I used to, I said carefully. But I don't know. I guess I've just learned to live with certain things. Like what? He pressed, his voice low. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Like not always getting what you want, or feeling stuck in situations you can't change. His gaze didn't waver, and the intensity of it made my pulse quicken. What if you could change it? He asked. Would you? I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. Sometimes it's not that simple. Maybe it is, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, the sound of the television fading into the background. I could feel the air between us shift, growing thicker, heavier. He moved slightly closer, closing the gap between us, and I froze, unsure of what to do. You deserve to be happy, he said softly. You deserve someone who sees you, who appreciates you. Luke, stop, I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't. I do, he continued, his eyes locked on mine. I see you. The words hit me like a jolt, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. "I can't do this," I whispered, pulling my hand away. "This isn't right." "I know," he said, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and longing. "But I can't help how I feel." I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. This can't happen. It's not fair to either of us." He looked at me, his expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if that was true. I need some time." He nodded, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back against the couch. I turned and walked back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I closed my bedroom door, I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The lines I had worked so hard to maintain were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. Part 2, A Breaking Point, Act 3, Part 2. The rain pattered against the windows the next afternoon, a steady rhythm that mirrored the chaos in my mind. I had spent the morning avoiding Luke, burying myself in housework, but by midday the clutter was gone, and I had nothing left to distract me. As I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counters for the third time, Luke walked in. His presence filled the room, and I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. "You don't have to keep cleaning," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "It's spotless in here." "I just need to keep busy," I replied, my voice flat. He watched me for a moment, then stepped closer. "Why are you avoiding me?" Not," I lied, refusing to meet his gaze. "Yes, you are," he said, his voice firmer now. "Did I do something wrong?" I sighed, setting the cloth down and finally turning to face him. "You didn't do anything wrong, Luke. This is on me." "On you?" he repeated, confused. I hesitated, searching for the right words. Whatever is happening between us, it's not right. I can't let it go any further." His brows furrowed and he stepped even closer. "Why not? We haven't done anything wrong." "But we could," I said, my voice cracking. "And that's the problem." He reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you. I can't stop thinking about you." "Luke," I whispered, my resolve crumbling. "This isn't fair to me, to you, to anyone." "Do you want me to leave?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "'Cause if that's what you want, I'll go." I looked at him, my heart aching at the thought. "I don't know what I want," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. His hand moved to cup my cheek and I didn't pull away. "I just want you to be happy," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. It was a gentle, tentative kiss, but it sent a wave of emotion crashing over me. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it, forgetting everything else. But then reality hit and I pulled away abruptly. "I can't," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry." He nodded, stepping back. "I'm sorry too." I turned and fled the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Upstairs, I locked the door behind me, sinking to the floor as tears streamed down my face. I didn't know how to fix what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I woke with a sense of dread pressing down on me. My heart still raced when I thought about the kiss, about the way his lips felt against mine, how I had let it happen, and how I had pulled away too late. The lines we crossed weren't just blurred anymore, they were shattered. I stayed in my room longer than usual, waiting for the sound of Luke moving around the house to disappear before finally venturing out. The kitchen was empty, the remnants of his breakfast still on the counter. I sighed, cleaning up the mess with shaking hands. The day dragged on. I buried myself in tasks to avoid facing him, but it didn't matter. His presence loomed even when he wasn't around. Every time I heard his footsteps, my pulse quickened, my stomach tightening with a mix of anticipation and guilt. When I finally saw him in the late afternoon, he was standing on the porch, fixing the loose step he had promised to repair. His shoulders were tense, and he didn't look up as I walked outside. "Luke," I said hesitantly. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Hey," I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "About last night? I just wanted to say I'm sorry." He stopped working and turned to face me fully, his brow furrowing. "You're sorry? I shouldn't have let that happen," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake." His jaw tightened and he crossed his arms. "It didn't feel like a mistake to me." "It was," I said firmly, though the words felt hollow. "You're my nephew, Luke. It's wrong. By blood, we're not even," he began, but I cut him off. "It doesn't matter," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "It's still wrong. It's not fair to either of us, and it's certainly not fair to Jacob." He looked away, his jaw clenching. "Do you even love him anymore?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't answer. "That's not the point," I said, finally. "It is the point," he countered, stepping closer. "You're miserable, and he doesn't even see it. I see you, and I—" "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. "Please, just stop." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, I'll stop, but don't pretend that nothing's changed between us, because it has." I didn't have an answer for that. Instead, I turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing on the porch. My chest felt tight, and I struggled to catch my breath. I wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were, but deep down. Part 2, Consequences Unfold. Act 4, Part 2. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the muted television. My husband Jacob was due to return from his business trip the next day, and the thought of facing him filled me with dread. How could I look him in the eye knowing what I had done? The door creaked open, and Luke stepped inside. He hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether he should come closer. I braced myself, expecting another confrontation, but instead, he sat quietly on the armchair across from me. "I think I should move out," he said finally. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had thought about asking him to leave, but hearing him say it first filled me with a deep sense of loss. "You don't have to do that," I said softly. Yes, I do," he said, his tone resolute. "This isn't good for either of us." I nodded, though my heart ached at the thought. "Where will you go?" "I'll figure it out," he said, looking away. "I have some friends I can stay with." The room fell silent, the weight of his decision settling between us. I wanted to say something, to ask him to stay, but I knew it was for the best. We couldn't keep living under the same roof, not after everything that had happened. "Will you leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow," he said, "before Jacob gets back." I nodded again, unable to trust my voice. He stood, lingering for a moment as if waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he turned and walked out of the room. I sat there long after he left, staring at the empty space he had occupied. The house already felt emptier, lonelier, and I wondered how I would cope once he was gone for good. The next morning, I stayed in my room until I heard the sound of the front door closing. I peeked out the window just in time to see Luke walking down the driveway, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't look back, and I didn't try to stop him. When Jacob arrived later that afternoon, he greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek and a distracted smile. He was already on his phone, discussing his next business deal, and I couldn't help but feel the chasm between us widening. "How was everything while I was gone?" he asked absently, scrolling through his emails. Fine, I said, my voice hollow. Everything was fine. That night, as I lay in bed beside Jacob, the silence between us felt deafening. My mind kept drifting back to Luke, to the way he had looked at me, the things he had said, the kiss that had changed everything. I knew I had to let it go, but the ache in my chest refused to fade. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. The house felt unbearably quiet after Luke left. It wasn't just the absence of his presence, it was the void he left behind, a reminder of the things I could never undo. I found myself going through the motions, completing daily tasks without really thinking about them. The days blurred together. Jacob remained as oblivious as ever, consumed by his work and rarely asking questions about my mood. In a way, his lack of attention was a relief. It meant I didn't have to explain the weight I carried or the ache that seemed to settle in my chest every time I thought about Luke. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I glanced out the window at the empty driveway. It was a habit now, looking for a car that wouldn't be there. I set the plate down and pressed my hands to the counter, my mind drifting back to the last conversation Luke and I had had. His words echoed in my mind. You deserve to be happy. But was I? I didn't know anymore. For years I had convinced myself that my marriage was enough, that the emptiness I felt was just part of life. But now the cracks in my carefully constructed facade were too large to ignore. I wasn't happy, and I hadn't been for a long time. I dried my hands and walked into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. Pulling out a notebook, I began to write, a habit I had picked up in my younger years but abandoned somewhere along the way. At first the words came slowly, hesitant and scattered, but soon they began to flow, spilling out in a rush of emotions I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. I wrote about the loneliness, about the moments of connection I had shared with Luke, about the guilt that weighed me down. I wrote about Jacob and the years of growing apart, about how I felt invisible in my own home. And as the words filled the page, I felt an odd sense of relief, as if releasing them onto paper lightened the burden on my heart. When I finished, I stared at the notebook, unsure what to do with it. The words were too raw, too honest to share with anyone. Not Jacob, not Luke, not even myself. But they were there, a record of the emotions I couldn't deny any longer. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Jacob had left early for a meeting, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The notebook sat in front of me, its pages closed, but its contents still fresh in my mind. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of avoidance and denial. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. Later that day, I called a therapist. The act of dialing the number felt monumental, like taking the first step toward reclaiming a part of myself that I had lost. When the receptionist asked what I needed help with, I hesitated for a moment before answering. Marriage counseling, I said. MP individual therapy. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but also right. For the first time in years, I was admitting that I needed help, that I couldn't fix everything on my own. When Jacob came home that evening, I approached him in the living room, where he was half watching a news program on his laptop. Chico, I said, sitting down beside him. He glanced up, his expression distracted. What's up? We need to talk, I said, my voice steady despite the nervous fluttering in my stomach. About us? He frowned, closing his laptop. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. I feel like we've been distant, like we're living separate lives under the same roof. He looked at me startled. I thought we were doing okay, you never said anything. Because I didn't know how, I admitted. but I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. I feel disconnected, and I think you do too." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I've been busy with work, and I know that's taken a toll. I didn't realize how much it was affecting you." "I'm not blaming you," I said quickly. "This is on both of us. But I think we need help. I called a therapist today. I want to try counseling." His brow furrowed, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then he nodded slowly. "If that's what you think we need, I'm willing to try." Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with uncertainty. Counseling was just the beginning, a small step on a long road, but it was a step, and that was more than I could have hoped for. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Luke. I wondered where he was, if he was okay, if he had found the peace he was searching for. Part of me wanted to reach out, to apologize for the way things had ended, but I knew that wouldn't be fair, not to him, not to me, and not to Jacob. The following morning, I woke to a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than running away from it. I picked up the notebook from my nightstand, flipping through its pages. The words felt like a lifeline, a reminder of where I had been and where I wanted to go. I closed it and placed it back on the table, determined to keep writing as I navigated this new chapter of my life. The weeks after Luke left were a blur of small changes and quiet realizations. The house began to feel normal again, though the silence was no longer suffocating. It was almost comforting. I found solace in the small routines I created for myself. Morning walks, journaling, even redecorating the living room to make the space feel more like my own. Jacob and I started attending therapy. Our sessions were slow, filled with awkward pauses and moments of frustration. But for the first time in years, we were talking. Not just about surface-level things like work or bills, but about our marriage, what had gone wrong, and what we could do to fix it. One evening after a session, Jacob turned to me in the car. "You know, I never realized how much I'd been taking you for granted." His words took me by surprise. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. "I mean it," he continued. "I thought keeping things running smoothly, work, the house, everything, was enough. But I see now that I stopped paying attention to you, to us. I'm sorry for that." His admission softened something in me, though I wasn't ready to forgive him entirely. "It's not just you," I said quietly. "I let it happen too. I stopped fighting for us." We drove the rest of the way home in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It felt like the beginning of something, a fragile thread of connection being rewoven. One rainy afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, the soft patter of raindrops on the window a soothing backdrop. I opened my journal, intending to write about the therapy session Jacob and I had just completed, but instead, I found myself addressing the one person I had neglected the most, myself. "Dear me, it's been a journey, hasn't it?" I paused, staring at the words. They felt foreign at first, but as I continued, they began to flow. "You've spent so many years trying to be everything for everyone else. A good wife, a good friend, a good host. But somewhere along the way, you forgot about yourself. You forgot that your happiness matters too." The tears came slowly at first, then faster, blurring the ink on the page. I wiped them away and kept writing. What happened with Luke was a wake-up call, not because of him, but because of what he represented. He made you feel seen, valued, and alive in a way you hadn't felt in years. And while what happened was wrong, it forced you to confront the truth. You were starving for connection. I set the pen down for a moment, taking a deep breath. The words felt heavy, but they were also freeing. You can't go back and undo the past, but you can learn from it. You can choose to stop living for others and start living for yourself. And that doesn't mean leaving everything behind. It means finding balance. It means finding your voice again. I signed the letter with shaky hands, then closed the journal, letting the weight of my own words sink in. That evening, Jacob and I sat together on the couch, something we hadn't done in years. The television played softly in the background, but neither of us was really watching. Instead, we talked about our plans, our fears, our hopes for the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. As I got up to head to bed, Jacob caught my hand. "I know it's going to take time, but I'm not giving up on us," he said. "Neither am I replied, and for the first time, I truly meant it. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Luke. I wondered if he had found his own peace, if he had begun to heal in his own way. A part of me hoped he had, though I knew I couldn't be a part of that journey. Letting him go was the right thing, for him, for me, and for my life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. There were still moments of doubt, moments where I questioned everything. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. I was learning to let go of the things that held me back, to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made, and to embrace the possibility of something better. As the rain continued to fall outside, I closed my eyes, feeling a quiet sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. It had been a month since Luke left, and the house was starting to feel less like a battlefield of emotions and more like the calm after a storm. Therapy with Jacob was slow but promising, and I was finally beginning to feel like I could breathe again. One rainy afternoon, I was cleaning out the guest room, Luke's old space. The air in the room felt stale, as though it still held the tension of those last few days. I pulled open the drawers of the small desk he had used, expecting them to be empty. Instead, I found a single envelope, unsealed, with my name scrawled across the front in Luke's handwriting. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won. With trembling hands, I pulled out the neatly folded piece of paper and began to read. "Dear On, by the time you find this, I'll be gone. I thought it would be easier to just leave without saying everything I'm about to write, but I couldn't leave without telling you the truth. I didn't mean for things to happen the way they did. When I first moved in, I just wanted a place to figure my life out. But you changed everything. Being around you made me realize what I'd been missing. Someone who listens, who cares, who sees me for who I am. I know it's wrong to feel the way I do about you, but I can't help it. You're more than my aunt. You're the person I can't stop thinking about. Leaving is the only way I can stop hurting both of us. You deserve happiness, and I know I can't be the one to give it to you. Please don't hate me. I'll never forget you." Luke. Tears blurred my vision as I read the final line. My hands trembled as I set the letter down, my emotions a chaotic swirl of sadness, regret, and guilt. The letter was raw, unfiltered, and painfully honest, but it confirmed what I had known deep down. Luke had been struggling just as much as I had, and I had failed to see the full extent of it. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the letter from my mind. I thought about reaching out to him just to make sure he was okay, but I stopped myself. He had made his choice to leave, and I had to respect that. Still, the words lingered, a quiet reminder of the line we had crossed and the consequences it had wrought. 2 weeks later, just as I was beginning to find my footing again, the doorbell rang. Jacob was at work, and I was alone in the house. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening the door. There he was. He stood on the porch, soaked from the rain, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. My heart raced, and I gripped the door frame for support. "What are you doing here?" I finally managed to say. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been staying with friends, but it's not working out." I wanted to close the door, to protect both of us from the turmoil his presence would bring, but I couldn't. Instead, I stepped aside, allowing him in. He set his bag down in the hallway, dripping water onto the floor. "Why didn't you call?" I asked, crossing my arms to hide the way my hands were shaking. "I didn't think you'd want to hear from me," he said, his expression conflicted. "But I needed to see you, to explain." "There's nothing left to explain, Luke," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "You left. We both agreed that was for the best." "I know," he said, his eyes pleading, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." "There is no us," I said, the words catching in my throat. "There can't be." He took a step closer, and I backed away, my heart pounding. "I'm not here to make things harder for you," he said quickly. I needed to know if you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, though it was a lie. "I'm trying to move on, Luke. You should too." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I'll leave if that's what you want. I couldn't let things end the way they did. I needed to see you one last time." And his words broke something inside me, but I knew I couldn't let my emotions take over. "Luke, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You'll find someone who can give you what you deserve, but that person isn't me." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with sadness. "I understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, he picked up his bag and walked back out into the rain. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it as tears streamed down my face. This time, I knew it was goodbye. For good. The house felt unbearably still after Luke left again. I leaned against the door for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of the rain fading as he walked away. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. This time, I knew he wouldn't be back. The next few days passed in a fog. Luke's visit had dredged up emotions I thought I had buried, leaving me raw and restless. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes as he walked away, the unspoken words lingering between us. Late one evening, after Jacob had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand. My fingers hovered over Luke's number, debating whether to call or let it go. I knew contacting him could reopen wounds that were barely starting to heal, but the weight of unfinished business was too much to bear. Taking a deep breath, I dialed the number. It rang several times before he answered, his voice hesitant. "Hello? "It's me," I said softly. There was a pause, and I could hear him exhale on the other end. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I wasn't sure I should call," I admitted, but I needed to say something. "I'm listening," he said, his tone unreadable. I hesitated, gathering my thoughts. "I'm sorry for everything. For the confusion, for the pain. I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't," he said quickly. "I hurt myself by letting it go too far." Tears pricked my eyes at the vulnerability in his voice. "I cared about you, Luke. I still do, but we both know this isn't something we can act on. It wouldn't just hurt us. It would hurt everyone we care about." "I know," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "That's why I left, but it doesn't make it any easier." "I know it doesn't," I said, my throat tightening. "But you deserve a chance to find someone who can love you the way you need, someone who isn't tangled up in all this." He didn't respond for a long moment, and I wondered if I had said too much. Then, finally, he spoke. "I want you to be happy, Aunt. You're an amazing person, and you deserve more than what you've been settling for." His words hit me harder than I expected. "I'm working on that," I said quietly. But I need you to do the same. Promise me you'll focus on yourself, on your future. I promise, he said, though his voice carried a hint of reluctance. We said our goodbyes, and as I ended the call, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The conversation had given me the closure I needed, but it also solidified the reality that I had to let him go, for good this time. The weeks that followed were a turning point. Jacob and I continued therapy, and though it was far from easy, we were making progress. For the first time in years, he seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings, and I made an effort to do the same for him. We were slowly rebuilding the foundation of our marriage, one fragile brick at a time. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob turned to me. "You seem different lately." "How so?" I asked, sipping my tea. "Lighter," he said, his brow furrowed in thought. "Like you're finally letting go of something." I smiled faintly, though the truth of his words struck a chord. "Maybe I am," I said. "I've been carrying a lot of weight for a long time. It feels good to finally put some of it down." He nodded, reaching over to take my hand. "I know I've let you down in the past, but I want to do better. For you, for us." "I want that too," I said, squeezing his hand. "But it's going to take time. We have to keep working at it." "Hell." "And we will," he said firmly. "I'm not giving up." Neither was I. One afternoon, while cleaning out my desk, I came across the letter Luke had left behind. I hadn't read it since the day I found it, and though part of me wanted to tuck it away and forget it existed, I couldn't resist unfolding the paper. The words still carried the same raw emotion, but this time they didn't sting as much. Instead, they felt like a reminder of how far I had come. Luke had been right about one thing. I deserved happiness. And though I had found it in an unexpected and complicated way, I was determined to hold on to it for myself and my marriage. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, sealing it shut. Then I tucked it into the back of a drawer, not as a secret, but as a chapter of my life that had come to an end. It was a part of my story, but it didn't define me. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward instead of back. Jacob and I planned a small getaway to the mountains, a chance to reconnect away from the distractions of daily life. It wasn't. On the morning of our trip, as we packed the car, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate, and for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house, thinking about all the moments it had held. The laughter, the tears, the mistakes, and the growth. It wasn't perfect, but it was home, and I was finally starting to feel like I belonged there again. Final reflection. Life is messy, and so are the relationships that define it. But in the end, it's not about perfection. It's about learning, growing, and finding a way to move forward. Luke had been a catalyst for change, a mirror reflecting the parts of myself I had ignored for too long. And though our paths had diverged, his impact on my life would always remain. As we drove toward the mountains, I closed my eyes and smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little more. The future was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was finally ready to embrace it. The crisp mountain air was invigorating, a sharp contrast to the stagnant feeling that had lingered in my life for so long. Jacob and I had arrived at the cozy cabin he'd rented for the weekend, a simple but thoughtful gesture that showed he was trying in his own way. I stepped outside onto the cabin's wooden deck, sipping my morning coffee as I took in the breathtaking view of the mountains. The golden light of dawn spilled over the peaks, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm that wasn't tinged with guilt or regret. Jacob joined me a few minutes later, his own mug of coffee in hand. He leaned on the railing, looking out at the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice softer than usual. "It is," I replied, nodding. "Thanks for bringing me here." "I thought it would be good for us," he said, glancing at me, "to get away from everything." "It was a good idea," I said, meaning it. The distance from home seemed to provide a clarity I hadn't known I needed. We stood there in silence for a while, the kind that felt comfortable and easy. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a step toward rediscovering the connection we had once shared. That evening, as Jacob cooked dinner, a rare occurrence that he insisted on, I decided to take a walk. The cabin sat on a secluded trail surrounded by trees, and the soft crunch of my boots on the gravel path was the only sound as I wandered through the forest. I thought about Luke. Though I hadn't heard from him since our phone call, I hoped he was doing well. Part of me wanted to reach out again, but I knew that reopening that door would only complicate things. Letting him go had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it had also been the right. When I returned to the cabin, I found Jacob setting the table. He smiled when he saw me, a genuine expression that softened his usually stoic features. "You're just in time," he said, gesturing to the 2 plates of pasta on the table. "Nothing fancy, but I think it'll do." "It looks great," I said, sitting down, and it did. Not just the food, but everything. The table set for 2, the effort he had put into making this trip special. For the first time, I saw Jacob as more than just the husband I had grown distant from. He was trying, and so was I. After dinner, as the fire crackled in the stone fireplace, I pulled out my journal. Jacob was engrossed in a book, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. I hesitated for a moment, then began to write. "Dear Luke, this is a letter I'll never send, but it's one I need to write. Thank you. Thank you for showing me what I had been ignoring for so long, for helping me see the parts of myself I had buried under years of routine and compromise. You brought light into my life at a time when I didn't even realize how much I needed it. I'm sorry for the pain we caused each other, but I hope you know that it wasn't for nothing. Because of you, I've learned to be honest with myself and to fight for the things that truly matter. I hope you find the happiness you deserve, Luke. I hope you build a life filled with love and purpose. And I hope someday you can look back on our time together and see it for what it was. A turning point, not an end. With love, always." As I finished the letter, I felt an odd sense of closure. I folded the paper and slipped it into the back of my journal, where it would stay as a quiet reminder of the lessons I had learned and the growth I had experienced. Jacob glanced up from his book, his eyes warm and curious. "What are you writing?" "Just reflections," I said with a small smile. He nodded, setting the book down and moving to sit beside me on the couch. "Whatever it is, I'm glad you're writing again. It's good to see you so alive." I leaned against him, letting his arm wrap around my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same path, walking toward a future we were building together. Final reflection. As I stared into the crackling fire that night, I realized something. Life isn't about perfect endings. It's about the messy, complicated journey we take to get there. Luke had been a part of that journey, a spark that reignited something in me I thought I had lost. But he wasn't the end of my story. This was my ending. A new beginning with Jacob, a chance to rebuild what we had let slip away. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. This conclusion provides a heartfelt resolution, focusing on closure, growth, and the narrator's journey toward a renewed sense of purpose and connection. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to refine or expand. The weeks following our trip to the mountains felt different, lighter. Jacob and I were far from perfect, but we were moving forward. The therapy sessions, the little moments of effort, and the quiet evenings spent reconnecting were beginning to rebuild the foundation of our relationship. I had doubted whether we could find our way back to each other, but for the first time, I felt hopeful. Still, a part of me couldn't help but think about Luke. His absence was like a faint echo in my life, a reminder of something profound yet fleeting. I hadn't heard from him since that final phone call, and though I had resisted the urge to reach out, I often wondered how he was doing. Was he finding his own path? Was he happy? The questions lingered in my mind like unfinished sentences. One rainy afternoon, as I sorted through the drawer where I had tucked away his letter, I found myself staring at it again. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, the weight of unspoken words pressing against me. I considered reading it once more, but decided against it. I didn't need to reopen old wounds. I needed to let them heal. Instead, I sat down at the desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write. Dear Luke, I hope this letter finds you well wherever you are. I'm not sending it, but writing it feels like the goodbye I never had the chance to give you. When you walked out of my life, you left a mark I'll never forget. You showed me parts of myself I had buried, emotions I thought I'd never feel again. For that, I'll always be grateful. You reminded me what it means to feel alive, to be truly seen. And while it was painful, it was also necessary. I don't regret what we shared, not because it was right, but because it opened my eyes to what I needed to change in my life. You were a mirror, reflecting back the things I had ignored for too long, and because of you, I've started to rebuild not just my marriage, but myself. But now it's time for both of us to move forward. You deserve a life full of joy and meaning, free from the weight of our past. I hope you find someone who loves you the way you deserve, someone who sees you for the incredible person you are. This is my farewell to you, Luke. Not just to the man you were in my life, but to the version of me I was when we met. I'm letting go of the guilt, the longing, and the what-ifs. It's time to leave this chapter behind. Take care of yourself, always. With love, and goodbye. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal, next to the one he had left for me. It felt fitting, like the closing of a loop. As I set the journal aside, I realized I wasn't sad anymore. The ache I had felt for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Later that evening, Jacob and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of beauty that made you pause and appreciate the moment. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. I'm proud of us, he said, his voice soft but steady. Me too, I replied, leaning against his shoulder. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. Saying goodbye to Luke wasn't just about him. It was about freeing myself from the weight of my mistakes and giving myself permission to move on. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, I knew I was ready to start again. The morning after I wrote my farewell letter to Luke, I woke early, just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. The world outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that invited reflection. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jacob, and wrapped myself in a sweater before heading to the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. As I sat with a warm cup of tea cradled in my hands, I let my mind wander. For so long I had been caught between the past and the present, haunted by choices I couldn't undo. But as I watched the sun slowly rise over the horizon, I realized something. The dawn wasn't just a new day. It was a reminder that life moves forward, no matter how tangled it might seem. Luke had been a chapter in my story, one that was now closed. But the lessons he had taught me, the importance of being seen, of valuing myself, would stay with me forever. As the golden light of the morning spread across the sky, I smiled. For the first time, I truly felt ready to embrace what lay ahead.